Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest who wrote an excellent book on World War II. His name is Walt Larimore, and the title of the book is At First Light, a true World War II story of the hero, his bravery, an amazing horse. And it was just published in 2022. He had a co-author, Mike Yorkie, and it's available in different formats: audiobook, Kindle, paperback. And right now on Amazon, it has 96 five-star reviews. And Walt has a bio in the back of the book. I'm just going to read part of it. Walt Larimore always had an interest in history and is the oldest son of Philip B. Larimore Jr., the hero in At First Light. As a writer, Walt is a prolific author and has been published 40 books, 30 medical textbook chapters, and over 1,000 articles in various journals and lay magazines. He's authored several bestsellers, garnered international and national writing awards, and his books have had sales of more than 750,000 units. In 2019, an early draft of At First Light received 2 international page-turner awards, the Finalist and Patrons Awards. He's been a doctor for 45 years and has been called one of America's best-known family physicians and is listed in the Best Doctors in America, Distinguished Physicians of America, Who's Who in Medicine and Healthcare, and Who's Who in America. And he also was granted by the Marquis Who's Who a Lifetime Achievement Award and was listed in the Who's Who in the World in 2021. And he graduated from Louisiana State University with AOA honors, while his family medicine residency had an emphasis in sports medicine and was at the Duke University Medical Center, where he was named one of the top 12 family medicine residents in the U.S. He's delivered more than 1,500 babies and still see patients part-time. His website is drwalt.com. So you can see that in the show notes. You can link to that, and I'll have a link to the book as well. It's a very well put together book, and he can talk about all the research he did on it. But again, the title is At First Light, a true World War II story of the hero, his bravery, and an amazing horse. And it's Walter L. Larimore. So Walter Larimore, welcome to the show.
William, it's great to be with you. Thanks for the privilege.
Awesome. So for people who may not have heard your name or your book, this is a history book. You are a medical professional. Can you kind of talk about your background, your dad, and kind of what led you to put together At First Light?
Yeah, great question. I remember as a young kid, I grew up in the 50s. And so all of us of that vintage watched World War II movies and TV shows. And in the backyard and out in the woods out back, my 3 brothers and I would replay some of the different wars and battles. We knew our dad had been in World War II just because he had lost a leg. In his office, there were shadow boxes of medals, and there were pictures signed by generals Eisenhower, Young, Truscott, McCarr. So we knew he'd been a hero, but he never would talk about it. Even ask Mom, what went on? What do you know? And she would just say, well, he doesn't want to talk about it. And that was that until their 45th wedding anniversary. And I guess he got nostalgic or began thinking back on the past and knowing that there wasn't that much time left in the future. And so at their anniversary, my brothers and I were sitting around with Dad, and I just asked him, you want to tell us any stories? And William, I guess the timing was right. He began to tell stories. They poured out, and they continued to pour out every time we met with him. And quite frankly, I didn't believe a lot of them. They were literally unbelievable. But when he passed in 2003, we were cleaning out his items and found a footlocker that had over 430 letters, had 3 history books that recounted the same stories that he told. And so I began to put together his letters and those stories into just a kind of a family document. It had a lot of holes in it, so I began to do research to find out where he had been, when he had been there, what the actual fighting was about. And William, that ended up being 16 years, almost 16 years of research in facilities, about 8 states, United States, where I went to different facilities, different museums, archives, and even overseas travel to Italy, France, and Germany to discover what ended up being some really remarkable stories and some secrets that had never been told before. It was a long, long journey of writing, rewriting, editing, re-editing, but I'm just delighted on how it's been received so far.
Yeah, congratulations. And it's a very well put together book. It's very chronologically ordered, maps, pictures too of your father and him with Eisenhower, very important to people as well. Can you kind of talk about his early life and where he's from and kind of what led him into the military? He was very young when he went in. Can you kind of talk about his
Yeah.
early background?
He was the only child born in 1925, growing up in Memphis. His mother was a paralegal before there were paralegals. She was the executive for one of the top attorneys at the top firms in Memphis. And because of that, she often worked 12, 14, 16-hour days, sometimes 7 days a week. His dad was a conductor on a Pullman Railroad. He would serve either on the City of New Orleans train that ran from Memphis to Chicago or Memphis to New Orleans, or the Sunset Limited. And so his dad would often be gone days at a time. And dad wasn't really good at school. And so he tended to get in trouble both at school and kind of became a bit of a juvenile delinquent, a recalcitrant, if you would. His mom tried some finishing schools, which didn't help at all. She tried Sunday school and vacation Bible school, and that didn't help at all. And so finally, my grandmom and granddad got exacerbated and frustrated. And so in his ninth grade year, they sent him off to Gulf Coast Military Academy down in Gulfport, Mississippi. And William, that's where he found himself. He really took to the military training, to learning to fly, learning to sail, learning weapons, learning military strategy. He became an ROTC leader and really sailed through military school. He finished military school about the time of Pearl Harbor. And so, because of his ROTC training and his recommendations, as a 17-year-old, he was able to go to the Army's Officer Candidate School, OCS, at Fort Benning, and became what still is the youngest ever graduate of Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning. He was 17 years old, just a month shy of his 18th birthday. Usually, you can't go to OCS unless you're a college graduate, and here he was, just barely a high school graduate, if you would. And then after that OCS training, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Army in January of 1943. And he became the youngest officer in the U.S. Army, trained in the U.S. for about a year as a glider pilot, as a company commander. He got marksman badges. He was trained as a paratrooper, so really significant training. And then finally was pulled out of the glider unit and sent overseas to land at Anzio in January of 1944, where he became what I believe is the youngest frontline officer in World War II. And through 15 months of fighting, one of the most decorated frontline officers of World War II.
Right. I mean, you have a list right there at the intro of the book of all of his decorations. It's almost like a full page. But he also, at that early age, he picked up a love for horses too. So he was an addition to all of his other accomplishments, kind of outdoorsman accomplishments. He really knew horses. Can you kind of talk about how that relationship with that animal started with him?
Well, it sort of went along with his outdoorsmanship. He wasn't good at school, but because his father was a Pullman conductor, he could take the train from Memphis to northeast Arkansas, where his mother's family was from, and he would spend Friday, Saturday, Sunday every weekend on the farms. He learned to ride. He learned to be a marksman. It was said when he was 8 years old that he could shoot a corn kernel off of a fence post from 50 yards away in any position, supine or kneeling or standing. He learned outdoorsmanship. He learned how to camp. He learned how to set up camps. He learned how to hunt. He learned how to stalk people and hide from people. He went into Boy Scouting, where he learned to swim and to be a lifeguard. In fact, in the flood of 1934, he and another boy actually swam across the Mississippi River, one of his best friends, Bill O'Bannon. And so in the middle of the flood, they swam across the Mississippi and then swam all the way back. And so that all of that background led him to develop an interest in horses. And they lived where he grew up. The house wasn't far from the stables where the draft horses that pulled the trolleys around downtown Memphis were kept. And so he would spend afternoons after school before his mom got home at this stable, learning to care for horses. And the stableman there said that he had a second nature with horses. He was a horse whisperer before horse whispers were popular. He could hear them. They could hear him. He could understand them. They could understand him. And so the stableman gave him a lot of responsibility early on with horses. And that sort of culminated on his 9th birthday when the Lipizzan stallions came from Austria, from Vienna, Austria, to do a show at the great Southern Coliseum there in Memphis. And so Dad went and spent a day with the Lipizzans, working with the stableman there, and actually, even as a kid, one of the he thought stablemen let him actually sit on a Lipizzan. Which, in fact, if you're being trained as a rider, what they call a rider, R-E-I-T-E-R, of the Lipizzans, you don't even get on a Lipizzan until you're 6 or 8 years of your training. And so this quote unquote stableman let Dad get on that Lipizzan, and it just changed his view of equestrianism. That night at his birthday celebration at the show, he found out that quote unquote stableman was actually one of the lead riders, and he brought one of the most highly trained of the stallions out to do all of the they call it the high school maneuvers, where they would jump and hop on legs. And at the end of that performance, that wonderful man brought that horse over and saluted Dad and sang happy birthday to him. And that just led to not only experiences growing up and not only experiences during training. When he was being trained at Alliance Air Base, he got exposed to draft horses and draft competition. Once he was in the war, he was exposed to dressage training in Naples. His horse experiences allowed him to introduce mules onto Anzio. He was the platoon leader of an ammunition and pioneer, an A&P platoon, which was working the front line, working in no man's land, very, very dangerous, working all night. And so he trained some mules to help carry supplies up front. That same training went into the Vosges Mountains in that horrible, horrible 1944, 1945 winter, perhaps the worst winter in the history of Europe at the time. Once again, got the mules involved. So horse story after horse story throughout the book that sort of concludes, if you would, with him being sent on a secret mission to find the Lipizzans that had been sequestered by Hitler to become the perfect horse.
Yeah, it's incredible. Like the horse is like all the way through. And like it was an interesting story of his friends. Like he started to, you use the term dressage in the book about his relationship with his fellow troops too, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, it's almost like he had a variety of equestrian experiences with war horses, but he also saw his men as war horses, as these incredibly well-trained, incredibly loyal men sacrificing their life for freedom and liberty. And it was interesting. William, I had always heard of the greatest generation. I think I probably wrote that off like many people my age, but studying the sacrifices and the suffering that these men went through, over 2 million men who fought in the European theater of operations. About a quarter of them became casualties, almost 400,000. And yet, although they went over there to fight for liberty and to be John Wayne and to be heroes, very quickly, at least on the front lines, they were exposed to the horrible conditions of war. In Anzio, it was the equivalent of World War I trench warfare. Ice, snow. You couldn't stick your head up without the possibility of it being shot off. The entire Anzio beachhead was within range of the guns, the German guns, and the shelling went on 24/7. The bombing went on 24/7. It was just horrible. And very quickly, these men developed a loyalty for each other, to protect each other, to fight with each other, and to get home. It was a real priority for them. But they were, I think, the greatest generation.
Yeah, it's amazing. Anzio was a very dicey beachhead just south of Rome, too. So this is an 18-year-old today. He would be considered like a kid, an adult over a whole platoon, right? Over 50 men, at least initially, these kind of NCOs and grunts, right? Can you talk
Oh
about
yeah.
kind of, yeah.
In fact, he was by far the youngest. he was the young man, if you would, and yet he was wise enough to have been introduced by his battalion leader, by his best friend. He had gone through OCS and met another man, Ross Calvert. They became best friends, and they ended up serving together throughout virtually the entire war, maintained their friendship after the war. But Ross really introduced him as a very young man to these veterans. Most of his platoon had actually been with the 3rd Infantry Division and the 30th Infantry Regiment since they had their first D-Day in Morocco. I interview people all the time, and I'll often ask them, what does D-Day mean to you? And they'll say, well, that obviously that means Normandy. But I've met almost nobody, maybe a couple, who know that the guys on the Southern Front had, well, at least the 3rd Battalion of the 30th Infantry Regiment had 7 D-Days, and the 3rd Infantry Division had 5 D-Days. The Northern Front had the Battle of the Bulge. We've all heard of that. Almost nobody knows that the Southern Front had 2 Battle of the Bulges. The Northern Front had the Hurtgen Forest, which was a horrific battle during the winter of 44-45. But arguably a much worse forest fight was in the Vosges Mountains in that same time. And the Battle of the Bulge, although if we'd have lost it, it would have been a terrific, horrible loss. But the Battle of the Colmar Pocket and the Battle of the Maison Rouge Bridge, arguably far worse. And had we lost that, William, there are historians who say we would have lost the war. We would have lost the Eisenhower's pincher move. And yet, by hanging on by a thread, despite some terrible leadership decisions, the grunts in the field fought off a single battalion, well, actually 2 battalions of Americans fought off between 3 and 5 divisions, panzer divisions, in this horrific battle. And so this story is a lot more than just a single man or a single platoon. It's the story of what I call the forgotten front of World War II, which is that Southern European front. Terrific battles.
Right, amazing. And the Vosges, I think you wrote in the book, had never been conquered. It has like a battle history of never falling. So that is another kind of indicator of how devastating it was. But
you're absolutely right. The Vosges Mountains, there were 6 major Army campaigns throughout history, and not one of them prior to World War II did the invading army stand a chance, because the mountains were very rugged, filled with swamps and thick forests, and you just could not beat an enemy that was dug in. Well, here comes the 7th Army up through France after their 5th D-Day in southern France, August 15th of 1944. They're racing up France, chasing the German 19th Army. They almost outrun their supply lines. And then when they get towards the winter begins to set in. They know the Germans are dug into the Vosges Mountains, and Truscott develops a battle plan, and the men exercise it day by day by day. Terrific casualties, terrific losses, and they become the first army in history to defeat an enemy in the Vosges Mountains. And yet I think one of the big differences in this greatest generation was that these young men, in Dad's case, this teenager, did not see themselves as conquerors. They did not see themselves as overthrowing the other army, but rather they saw themselves as liberators. They wanted to liberate people who had lost their freedom, who had lost their liberty. And to that end, they were successful, William.
Right, and they were welcomed on the way. There's many vignettes in your book about how warm the locals, whether Italians or French, were to them. And so there was kind of a symbiotic relation. There's like little pauses in the wars where your dad was like talking to an Italian family, or the French are helping him out or feeding them. So I thought that was interesting too. So they didn't see them, but he was wounded. I mean, high fever, shot in the arm, really banged up too. Can you talk about what happened when he went to, like, a lot of people may know the name Audie Murphy, but maybe you can talk about him and your dad.
Yeah, said to be the most decorated of the frontline soldiers in World War II, had every major medal of valor. Dad actually had every major medal except the Medal of Honor. But they met. Dad was awarded 7 Purple Hearts. He turned down 3 of them because he did not feel they were worthy of the Purple Heart. The first one he turned down, William, was actually when he got malaria in Anzio. As the thaw was, as they were coming out of winter, as all of these swamps that had been flooded by Hitler, he knew, Hitler and Mussolini, they knew that if they damaged the dams and flooded this land that had been reclaimed, that the mosquitoes, when they came out, would the malaria would just devastate the U.S. Army or the Allies. And so Dad actually caught malaria, and that was his first hospitalization. His first day in the hospital, he's burning up with 105-degree fever, and this soldier walks around and throws a Purple Heart on every bed. In other words, if you were in the hospital, you got a Purple Heart. And Dad said, nope, not me. I'm not accepting it for malaria. In fact, after only 2 days in the hospital, he sort of went AWOL, if you would, from the hospital, and said, I'm going back to my guys. I'm going back to my men. A real side bunny trail of that, just real quick, William, is that because the Axis controlled Southeast Asia, they controlled all of the medication, the quinacrine, that was used to treat malaria. So Mussolini was convinced that by flooding these fields, by exercising biologic warfare, that he could defeat the army and Hitler could defeat the army just with malaria. But fortunately, there was an experimental drug in the U.S. called quinacrine, and that came over, and actually Dad took it. It saved countless lives from malaria. But beyond that, he had 6 other times that he was wounded. The second most serious of those was a leg wound that occurred during the Vosges Mountains. He and one of his men were taking ammunition and supplies into a group of raiders. It turns out they got surrounded by an elite German infantry division, and at the very last second, almost when it was they were to be overrun, he was shot in the leg and was evacuated, went to a hospital in southern France, and in the cot next to him in the officers' ward was this young man from Texas, Audie Murphy. And so they met, became friends. They had a very similar medal count at that point, very similar wounds, and they were treated by the same nurse. They called her Pricey, but Nurse Price and Audie began to develop a relationship. Audie Murphy actually proposed to her at the hospital. She turned him down. He later proposed to her again. She turned him down again, and then they never did get married, although they did stay in touch after the war. But Dad interacted with Audie Murphy both in the hospital and then during the Battle of the Colmar Pocket. He also interacted with Maurice Footsie Britt. Maurice Britt was the first U.S. Army soldier to win all of the medals of valor. He had the Medal of Honor, the Legion of Merit, the Silver Star, and the Bronze Star, only to be outdone by Audie Murphy. But Maurice Footsie Britt was the company commander for Company L, Love Company, of the 3rd Battalion of the 30th Infantry Regiment. And so Dad was a second lieutenant at 18, a first lieutenant at 19, a captain at 20, and then he took over Love Company and became one of the youngest, if not the youngest, frontline company commanders of World War II when he took over Love Company during the Colmar Pocket.
So how many troops did he have under his command at the last part? I don't even know how big a company is.
Yeah, well, a company could be anywhere from 100 to 180 men. I don't know the exact number of the time that he took over. It was right in the middle of the Colmar Pocket. He was still serving as the commander for the A&P platoon, and then the young lieutenant that was the company commander for L Company was wounded, had to be evacuated during the battle, right towards the end of the Colmar pocket. And so Dad was put in as the company commander, interim company commander, but did such a good job of leading the men. That story is one of the sweeter stories. Once again, almost everyone older than him. And then he maintained that position of the company commander of L Company until just a month before the end of the war, when one of his point platoons was surrounded by a division of Germans, and he had to go in and save them, which he did with the loss of only one man, but with the loss of his leg.
That was it. Yeah. So he unfortunately lost his leg. I think he was shot in the arm too at one point, like it went through, but didn't break a bone. So he was very close to the end. And very interesting stories. Like he saw Churchill, and a lot of Americans don't know the whole drive from Anzio to the south of France and up the kind of, I think it's the Loire Valley. But I mean, that's a really interesting story that I think you cover really well. Can you kind of talk about him being in the water and how they kind of made their way? I think they had to join up with Patton, right? Or Montgomery. Can't remember.
No. Montgomery and Patton were both on the northern front, but there was the Allies coming up from Monte Cassino and the Gustav line that were coming towards Rome, and then the breakout from Anzio, which was in May of 1944, and our listeners and viewers need to remember that Anzio was completely surrounded by mountains, and those mountains were inhabited, deeply dug in by Germans. And so a breakout was predicted to be a very costly campaign. It was very well planned. During the nights of the month before that, 3 divisions were brought in under the secrecy of night. Supplies were brought in under the secrecy of night. This massive campaign was initiated, and when the breakout began, the 2 pinchers, the one from Anzio and the one from Monte Cassino, both were heading up to Rome together, and they were actually sort of in a race to see who would get there first. General Clark and the U.S. Divisions under him wanted to be the first into Rome, and so they fought up. It was horrific fighting to work up towards Rome, and then finally the Germans abandoned Rome at the last minute. And so then in June 4th and 5th of 1944, the Americans took Rome. There's great debate about who was the first in. Dad and his men said they were the first in. Other regiments said they were the first in. I don't think history has settled that question at all. But the mistake they made, if you would, William, was that they liberated Rome on June 5th of 1944. And so headlines were being prepared for all over the United States, massive headlines, big fonts saying Rome has been liberated. Those headlines were going to run on June 6th and June 7th of 1944. Eric Severide, who was later a journalist with CBS News and CBS Evening News, was embedded with the 3rd Infantry Division. And he tells a story in his biography of how all of the journalists were preparing their stories on June 5th. And the way it worked was that the journalists would have teletype access, deep cable access across the Atlantic, 1 hour a day maximum. The other 23 hours a day were all for military use. So that night of June 6th, they were all preparing to teletype their stories that were going to burst across the headlines of America the next day. And a BBC journalist walked in and said, "Boys, throw your papers away. The invasion of France has begun up in Normandy." And so they quickly became, it was already the Forgotten Front, but now the first liberation of a major capital in Europe became a page 14, a page 16 story. In fact, when I've interviewed people, I've asked them, what was the first capital liberated in World War II in Europe? People almost universally say, well, it was Paris. Well, Paris was liberated by the northern guys in August of 1944. But very few people know the first city liberated was Rome on June 5th of 1944. So the guys kind of had, the Southern Front guys kind of had a chip on their shoulder that they didn't get the PR. My take on that is that after the Kasserine Pass and after when Patton came in, Patton was a PR hound. He loved embedding with journalists, taking them with him. He did that through Sicily. And then when he was taken away from the Southern Front and then later moved to the Northern Front, he, Bradley, and Montgomery were all PR hounds. They all had the press with them. They all had the press traveling with them day to day. The Southern Front generals didn't have that interest in the press. Their interest was fighting and winning a war. And so I think that contributed to what I call the forgotten Southern Front. And my hope and prayer is this book will help resurrect and reinvigorate that amazing front. The Northern guys, incredibly brave. Their suffering and sacrifice was huge. But they fought for 336 days. On the Southern Front, those guys fought for 913 days.
That's where it all started, right? It started in Morocco.
It all started, and in a way it ended. You know, the Southern Front guys fought across Northern Africa, into Sicily, into Italy, across Southern France, in through Alsace of France. They crossed the Rhine River 3 times. The Northern guys crossed it once. They raced through not only Southern Germany, but also into Austria. And so they fought on more fronts, more countries, had more medals of honor, more silver stars, more bronze stars by far than the Northern Front. They were equally important because that pincher mood that Eisenhower designed was critical to winning the war. But I hope we can remember and recognize and shout out to the men and women that were on the Southern Front, the forgotten front.
And you do include biographies of some of the people he fought with, names that I hadn't heard of. So I really appreciated that at the end of the book. And it's very easy to follow where these battles are commencing through the maps that you have in the book as well. Can you talk a little? The Lipizaners are kind of a famous horse that you can see online. It's a big, beautiful white stallion, and they kind of are able to kind of train them to do jumps and stuff like that. Can you talk about the secret mission your dad had involving those?
Yeah, towards the end of the war, rumors started coming out of Czechoslovakia about Hitler's program to develop a royal breed, a perfect breed. You know, he had his sights set on the Aryan race, the quote unquote perfect race, and he wanted to have the perfect horse, the perfect war horse for the perfect race. And so early, even before World War II, he began to sequester onto specialized horse farms all of the royal breeds of Europe. So these were horses like the Berbers, the Andalusians, the Frisians, thoroughbreds, and Lipizans, the dancing horses of Vienna, Austria. And so there were a number of horse farms where these breeds were being developed. As the breeding continued, he made his choice that he wanted to have the Lipizan, the beautiful white horses. They're actually a gray. They're born, they're black, and then they turn white and they kind of become gray. But the way their coats are, it looks a beautiful, beautiful white. But the way that the breeding program was going, it was a very unethical and a potentially dangerous breeding program because brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers were all bred. And so the Nazi vets, who were really quite caring and quite good vets, became, first of all, very upset about the breeding program. Second of all, very upset about the way POWs were used to keep the horses. And then third of all, because of the agreement between Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, the Russians were given the job of liberating Czechoslovakia. But the concern the vets had were the rumors that because of the starvation in Russia, that the Russian army was killing and cooking and eating anything in its path. And then on one fateful evening, there were it's a trailer. It's not clear whether there were 20 or 25 Lipizans in the trailer, but the Russians captured it, killed all but one of the Lipizans, skinned them, cooked them, and ate them. So this panic ensued in the horse farms that these royal breeds were going to disappear. And so a message was sent covertly through intelligence to the U.S. Army saying, please come save these horses. And so it wasn't clear if it was a true message or not. Let me give you a real example why. Dad's first 3 days on Anzio, the first night he worked all night on. The first night he took one of his men out. They were setting mines, and the man made a mistake. And right next to Dad, he blew off his face. And then the next day, Dad, as they were walking back just at dawn, one of his men was hit by an 88, an anti-aircraft armament that was shooting horizontal that literally cut his man in half right beside him. And then the third night, they were heading towards dawn, and 2 German soldiers in no man's land stood up, waved white flags, started yelling, "Comrade, comrade, comrade," which was the word they would use for surrender. And one of Dad's new men, an older enlisted man, started to stand up to take the prisoners, and Dad screamed at him, "No," because the Germans were known to have these fake surrenders. And as soon as Dad's man stood, he was shot through the head by a German sniper. And then the 2 fake surrenders quickly went down and ran away. The Germans were known for booby trapping even the bodies of Allied soldiers. And so when this rumor came that the Nazis wanted the U.S. Army to come in and save these horses, there was great suspicion that there's nothing like it. And it was just an attack, even here at a month from the end of the war, of getting a company or a few platoons and then just wiping them out, just destroying them. So the decision was made to send in a small Piper Cub that was a reconnaissance plane with a pilot and with a man who knew horses. And they needed a volunteer to fly 200 miles into Czechoslovakia, land in the forest. The underground would meet them and then take them. One of the Nazi vets would meet them, take them to the farm to confirm that there were not only these horses, particularly Lipizzans, but also POWs. And so Dad was asked to do that. He volunteered. The conditions were pretty severe, William. He was told, "You'll have no identification, neither you nor the pilot. You and the pilot are not basically to talk to each other. We don't want you to know who each other is in case you're caught and tortured. But you'll have no identification. So if you're captured, your mission will be disavowed. You'll be considered AWOL. If you're killed, you'll be considered AWOL, and there'll be no life insurance. There'll be no benefits for your family or your fiance or anybody." And Dad, without even, at least according to the records, without even thinking about it, said, "I'll do that." And the next morning before dawn, they took the Piper Club. They flew almost 200 miles in Czechoslovakia. It was a cloudy day, which helped in the sense that it was easier for them to not be seen, but much harder to navigate. The fuel capacity of that plane was 180 to 200 miles. So they literally, William, they ran out of gas, and they hadn't even found the airstrip. And so as they were gliding, Dad saw the little clearing where the lanterns were set out, and then he guided the pilot down. And because he had his glider wings, he knew gliding. He knew they'd be safe. So they landed. The Nazi vet came out, actually riding a Lipizzan, and also he brought a thoroughbred because he wanted the Army soldier to be able to ride a horse that wasn't quite as big or quite as feisty. And he didn't know Dad was a equestrian, but once they met, they rode to the farm where Dad identified indeed the Lipizzans were there. And then they had a little fun interaction. This guy's name was Captain Lessing, and they had a steeplechase course. So Lessing let Dad ride the Lipizzan and then get back on the thoroughbred. And then they actually had a race through the steeplechase course. And Dad's story is that he won. I have no independent documentation of that, but his other stories were true, so I believe it. And then they got in the plane, flew back, and that information that the horses were there, that there were POWs there, that information went up to high command where it went to Patton. Remember that for the U.S. to enter Czechoslovakia was essentially a war crime. It was illegal. They could not do it because the Yalta Agreement specified that only the Russians would liberate Czechoslovakia. But nevertheless, Patton approved what was called Operation Cowboy, and a cavalry unit went in, not without difficulty, that actually walked the Lipizans and a number of other royal horses out of Czechoslovakia and back into Germany, and actually probably saved the Lipizans.
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah. And that's like a rich tradition, right? The Lipizzaner tradition associated with Austria-Hungary, going back in time, Eastern Europe.
Hundreds and hundreds of years. And later, the Austrians were so grateful to the Americans for saving the Lipizans that they actually sent, I believe it was 8 Lipizans to Arlington at Fort Myer in Washington to become a caisson platoon to bury American heroes. After the war, Dad was assigned to Fort Myer. The main reason he was assigned there was because he had lost his leg, and the U.S. policy, the War Department policy at the time, was if you were an enlisted person and you lost a limb, if you found a job in the Army, you could stay. They honored you. But if you were an officer and you lost a limb, you were no longer considered officer and gentleman material. In fact, in some of the leadership, you weren't even considered human. It was a very inhumane policy that said as soon as you were rehabilitated, you were kicked out. And Dad felt that was unfair, unreasonable, inhuman. And so he put together a strategy with congressmen, with senators, with General Eisenhower, with President Truman, to actually fight that unfair policy. And so they brought him to Fort Myer so he could fight there. The battle, he could communicate with Congress, he could communicate with high-level generals, and go through this appeal of this horrible policy. In fact, I remember the day, William, that I was in College Park, Maryland, at the U.S. Archives, and I found the actual transcript of that trial. And if any of our viewers have ever watched the movie A Few Good Men, where the character of Tom Cruise is in a courtroom battle with the character played by Jack Nicholson, it's this intense trial. And that's what this trial was. It was an ugly, intense trial. I won't go much into it because I don't want to ruin what the book has to say. But anyway, Dad there not only was the executive officer, but he's also the commander of a caisson platoon. And the caisson has 6 horses pulling the caisson that would have the coffin of the soldier being honored. And then there would be, if it was a colonel or above, there would be a horse behind the caisson. That was the empty saddle horse, the capsaicin horse with the boots turned around. And then there would be the horse that the executive officer would ride. And all of those horses were the same color. They'd either be white or gray or bay, but all of the horses would be the same color. But the caisson, the 6 horses, would have 3 riders, one on each horse on the left, one on each pair. The right horse of each pair would not have a rider. And then there was, of course, the executive officer. All 4 of those men, now men and women, but then all 4 of those men would have to tell the horses to move, but they could not utter a vocalization. They could not be seen to move. And so they had what was called a 2-leg lead, where they might flick a thigh muscle or move a toe slightly, but all of those had a particular meaning to those horses. But Dad only had 1 leg. So as far as I can tell, he was the first equestrian in the history of equestrianism that taught a horse to a 1-leg lead. It was really quite remarkable.
Interesting. And he had he was very young when the war was over, right? In 45. He had a incredible life even after that, representing, fighting for rights for people who got disabled and things like that. And
he was a major at 22, and I'm told you don't become a major typically until you're 30, 35, or even older. So second lieutenant, actually out of OCS at 17, was commissioned a second lieutenant at 18 on his 18th birthday, first lieutenant at 19, captain at 20, and then a major at 22. It was just remarkable what those men did and what they went through.
It really is. It's an incredible story. A great, very well written book and put together book too. So I commend.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, because it's a history book, but it's chock full of romance. It's chock full of these war horse stories. It's chock through with this legal fight for amputees and what he went through, the discrimination that he went through as an amputee, not just from other Army officers, but from women. They typically loved men with a uniform and medals, but boy, when they found out he didn't have a leg, it was much more difficult. And I think one of the sweet part of the stories is how he developed horse therapy in the hospital that he was in for other amputees. It was an amputee hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. And then how the chaplains, the Army chaplains, were wise enough to be able to counsel him and how he could overcome this, being an amputee. In one of his letters that he wrote, he actually talks about his self-image being damaged, his future was uncertain, and he was talking to one of the chaplains about that. And what he wrote, it's one of my favorite quotes in the book. I've got it if I could share it real quickly.
Please do. Yes, please do.
So he was confessing these awkward feelings, and this is what he wrote that the chaplain told him. He said, "Son, your wound will either make you a bitter person or a better person. It'll either harden your heart or it'll soften it. You'll either be a person changed for the worse or one who chooses to make the world better. In my opinion," this chaplain said, "the worst disability in life isn't being disabled. It's being disabled with a bad attitude. The Germans smashed your leg, but don't let them shatter your heart, your talents, your gifts, your will, or your faith in God and the plan he has for you. The choice is up to you, but you need to make that choice." And that for Dad was a real game changer, to think, well, how do I be a better person? How do I change the world despite this terrible disability?
It's amazing. Yeah, he had an amazing life. And really, one of the other aspects of the books is all these letters that you went through. He's communicating with your grandma, your grandfather, sending letters. Back in the day, those missives were all important, sending these letters. So you include those in the book to great effect, I think, because it just shows the authenticity and what people were thinking at that time. But while we are at the 50-minute mark, where's the best place for people to get At First Light? What do you recommend?
Oh, well, any of the online sites have it available. It's in hardback. It's an audio book. The paperback will probably be out next year. I love the narration. The one of the best audio narrators in America. He does Stephen King's books, does Vince Flynn's books. He's done the Bible. He's done all the classics. But
What's his name?
George, I forget his last name. I'm blanking on it. But
okay.
the narration on the audiobook is just spectacular. He does all the different characters in a wonderful way. It helps bring the book to life. It is a history book, but it's written in a newer genre called narrative nonfiction or creative nonfiction, where it's written, as I think you've indicated, much more like a novel, chock full of conversation and shocks and twists in the plot, but very short chapters. And I think that's one of the reasons it's up again for an International Page Turner Award. It had not been announced, but it'd be announced next month, but it's in the finalists for the best book, nonfiction book, the best co-written book, the best book by a golden author. I guess I'm a golden author, and also for best audio book and best cover. So I'm delighted with the way it came out. And I really appreciate your feedback that you enjoyed that page turning aspect.
Yeah, George Guidall,
Guidall.
Yeah. And also another aspect that I learned, I'm not a real military weapons and equipment, but you really have that element in this book. You point out what the Germans were doing and kind of all the equipment that was involved, so you can kind of see what was going, the World War II application of military.
Yeah, and for the military man and woman and the historian, there were 5,800 primary sources, over 750 citations. But I've tried to make that where it's not a disturbing part of the book. And so a lot of the military language is pulled out of the text and put into footnotes for those that want to know what a potato masher is and what a Sherman tank is and what the difference is in an M1 Garand and an M1 carbine, and what the difference in a heavy machine gun and a light machine gun, et cetera, et cetera. That information is available. I've had a number of reviewers reviews have been amazing, how well reviewers have received it. But a number of them said, well, I read it first for the story, and then I went back later and read the footnotes and reached an even deeper level of understanding of this, truly the greatest generation. And one real quick thing, William, you mentioned that, Dad wrote 436 letters, and this book wouldn't exist without those letters. And one of my encouragements to our viewers and listeners would be, all of us do emails and we do text, but I hope this book will be a reminder that there's nothing quite like the written note, something you take the time to hand write and send to somebody. But especially for your children, your grandchildren, your nieces, your nephews, to be able to leave behind a bit of your legacy in writing is a lost art. And it's something that I hope more people will be encouraged to do because of this book.
Yeah, and it just shows that repository of his writing passed on into this book. Maybe something he didn't even expect.
Yeah, right.
Was re-put up so other people like me can appreciate it. So it's very important. And you had a lot of big military names wrote about how great the book was too. So some of those
I couldn't believe it.
The
The first person that reviewed it was David Petraeus, the former commander of Afghanistan, former director of the CIA. I don't know him, but one of our technical advisors, who's a physician and an infantry person, sent it to him, and he contacted me. He said he read it in 3 days, and he wanted to know if I would accept his endorsement. And he in fact, his endorsement's on the front of the book. He said, this story is extraordinary. Don't miss this remarkable book. But there's four-star generals who endorsed it, including the first female Army 4-star officer, Air Force 3-star and 2-star general. But then the athletic legends, Coach K, Coach Krzyzewski, the head basketball coach at Duke, also read the book in 3 days during his last season and of coaching, and endorsed it along. Joe Gibbs, 3-time Super Bowl winner, 3 times NASCAR winner, gave it a beautiful endorsement. Dan Reeves, who was a Super Bowl champion coach and player, Dan read it on his deathbed. I didn't realize at the time that he was terminal, but it was the last book he read and the last book he endorsed, and his endorsement is there. Pat Williams, who founded the Orlando Magic, is a World War II aficionado. Several editorialists that endorsed the book, and then novelists, best-selling New York Times novelists who endorsed it. And so, as a first-time writer in this genre, I'm not a historian, I'm not a big famous writer, but to have that type of praise, I think, allows people who don't know me from Adam to say, hey, this may be a book worth picking up.
Good point. And I think that the reviews on Amazon are indicative of that. 96 5-star reviews right now, audiobook. And your website is drwalt.com. If people want to reach out to you or follow up with you, is that a good place to send?
Absolutely. drwalt, Dr. Walt, drwalt.com. They can sign up for an email. I send it every day. It's got health and book type stuff. Comes out on a daily basis at drwalt.com. And feel free to write me. I'd be glad to interact with anybody who would. I just am back from New Orleans, actually, William. The Military Writers Society of America gave the book a silver medal. And then as of today, it's up for another 8 major book awards. And
wow.
So I hope that will all facilitate more of us learning about and remembering this forgotten friend as we head towards Veterans Day. And then, of course, next year, Memorial Day. I hope that on those days when we're picnicking and barbecuing, that we'll remember. We'll tell a story, even a brief story, about the men and women who preserved liberty from fascism and totalitarianism. And even in these times of great political debate and divide, I hope there's one thing that we can agree upon. And there was a time when the world was on a precipice, and America fought for and saved freedom and liberty. And I hope we can always honor our men and women who serve in uniform.
I hope so too. Great discussion. Thanks so much for your time. Congratulations on the book and its awards. Full title again is At First Light, a true World War II story of the hero, his bravery, and an amazing horse. The author, again, full name is Walter L. Larimore, and I will put his website in the show notes so you can contact him there. Walt, thanks so much for your time.
You're more than welcome. Thanks for the privilege, Wayne.
All right, great. Stay there.